Hello, I'm Suzanne Spaulding, Senior Advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I lead the Defending Democratic Institutions Project. And I want to welcome you to this conversation entitled The Rule of Law, Help or Hindrance to National Security. And I will confess right off the bat that I am biased here, a longtime national security lawyer myself. Throughout my career, I have invited some of my very favorite national security law practitioners to join with me today in this conversation. But we hope that this will be the first of a number of conversations talking about checks and balances for national security. The rule of law is certainly one of the most important of those. And so very pleased today to have with us Glenn Gerstel, a colleague here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, senior advisor here, former National Security Agency General Counsel, and so we'll bring in both the Obama administration
Correct.
And Trump administrations. And so we'll bring some really unique insights to the conversation. And Bruce Schwartz, a more recent addition to the team here at CSIS, also a senior advisor. And how many years?
25.
25 years at the Department of Justice. He was Deputy Attorney General for the Department of Justice and Counselor for International Affairs. Basically ran all of the international affairs issues for the department for many years. And so thrilled to have both of you here with us in person. And Jeff Smith had hoped to be here in person in Washington, D.C. You never know when they're going to shut down roads, and he's stuck in traffic, but hopes to join us before the end of the program. And Jeff Smith was, of course, CIA General Counsel, also many years with the Armed Services Committee in the U.S. Congress, and if I remember correctly, started his career in the military. So great team to be giving us a sense of, initially, what do we mean by the rule of law? And then how is that institutionalized across government, in the national security world and across government? And what have our experiences shown in terms of the impact on our national security of that commitment to the rule of law? And then I hope we're going to have time to talk about what's happening today and how we should be thinking about that. So let's start. Bruce, you're the Department of Justice lawyer. Tell us what it is we're going to be talking about as we talk about the rule of law, because I think it means a lot of different things to different people.
Well, thanks, Suzanne. I think you're absolutely right. Although I think it's also fair to say that this is a country that was founded on the concept of rule of law. As John Adams put it, this was a country where the government was to be of laws, not of men, or of women, for that matter. Or as Thomas Paine put it in Common Sense, in America, law is king. But as you know, philosophers, legal experts have debated about what exactly we mean by rule of law. Is it just a procedural set of rules? Does it have substance? I think it's fair to say that there's general consensus that, at least at a minimum, rule of law sets out several principles. That rules should not be arbitrary and capricious, that they should be prospective, not retroactive, that they should apply to all, and that individuals should have a right to appear before an independent tribunal to actually make the case as to how those laws should apply to them. Now, there's a debate about whether that is all there is to it, or whether that set of processes actually has within it a set of substantive principles, what sometimes people have called the inner morality of these procedural rules. And I think it's fair to say that there are some principles to be drawn from this. The idea of rule of law suggests that individuals have agency, that they have dignity, and that they should be respected. And as Justice Kennedy said in speaking about rule of law to the American Bar Association, when Americans speak of rule of law, they incorporate the idea of access to justice, of equal justice for all, for the chances for equality. This is in complete contrast to, as we know from our experiences working together overseas, rule by law, which really is the view in which it's the state that controls the legal principles, not to advance the autonomy of individuals, but rather to subject them to the will of the state. It's summed up in the statement that's attributed to many dictators that for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law. And it's fair to say that over the last quarter century and more, the United States has dedicated itself to the proposition that advancing the rule of law, both internally and internationally, is key to our national security. Internally, we've done that through sections of the Department of Justice, such as the Public Integrity Section, which has gone after corrupt actors, political actors of both parties at the federal, state, and local level. We've done it as well through our inspectors general and others, the system created to ensure that we have oversight of government and that government is acting fairly. And internationally, we've done it in 3 different ways. We've, first of all, made sure that our prosecutorial and investigative resources are used to help countries recover funds that have been stolen by corrupt leaders through the Kleptocracy Initiative and otherwise. We've also, through the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, made sure that American corporations are not furthering corruption overseas. And we've structurally worked with countries around the world in the UN to create the UN Convention Against Corruption, the OECD Convention Against Anti-Bribery, the Group of States Against Corruption at the Council of Europe. And then finally, in programs that I administered at the Department of Justice, we had prosecutors and agents around the world, funded through US foreign assistance funding, working on building rule of law with our counterparts on the theory that the United States is safer and that citizens of this country are safer when we have like-minded countries, like-minded partners that we can count on to act in a non-corrupt manner to advance our common goals. But I'll leave it there and be glad to come back to this.
Oh, that's great, and we will come back to that because I want to, hear some specific examples, some of your stories, and also, we really want to get at why should Americans care about this,
Absolutely.
right? What impact does it have on them? And Glenn, and I want to welcome Jeff. Jeff, so glad that you're able to join us, even just virtually. And I'm sorry for what the District of Columbia has done to you this afternoon, but thank you for your perseverance. Oh, he's muted. Jeff, we can't hear you, so give us a minute, but I'm going to go to Glenn. Glenn, when I was a lawyer at CIA, I worked a lot with folks at the National Security Agency, and I certainly had it was very clear to me that the NSA certainly took in those days adherence to the rule of law very seriously, understanding how important that was for them in order to be able to sustain the public's trust and continue to do what they do. Tell us a little bit about how you saw the commitment to the rule of law institutionalized at NSA, across the intelligence community, and across the government.
Sure. Well, again, thank you for doing this. But I came to the NSA from almost 4 decades in the private sector, so I really did not have experience in the world of the intelligence community and in particular the nature of the surveillance that was conducted by the National Security Agency. So when I came to the agency, I thought, wow, I'm going to have to be an outside lawyer coming in, and not only will I have to understand the law, of course, but I'll have to be the sort of first line of defense saying, no, you can't do that. You have to honor the Constitution. You have to make sure you're complying with the rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. So I really thought I'm going to be coming into a bunch of tough battles and some difficult situations. And none of that ever happened. It didn't exist. When instead I had the exact opposite reaction, which is I came there and discovered, wow, everyone here is particularly zealously focused on the rule of law. People have a full, detailed, rich understanding of the relevant rules. They want the layers of oversight and redundancy of regulations that are applicable in this area for good reason, because let's face it, the National Security Agency and to some extent other parts of the intelligence community, including the FBI domestically under its own lawful authorities, engages in surveillance, which is intrusive in privacy. And if there ever is an area where we want to make sure that the public is supporting these types of activities for the sake of our national security to keep our country safe, this is an area that's sort of at the cutting edge of it. This is where we're dealing with sort of questions about exactly how does the Fourth Amendment apply, And so it's an area where there's going to be it's more fraught, there's going to be some more tension. So this is exactly where we want to make sure we have the most public confidence in something. And that's exactly why I sometimes joked that coming from the private sector, I thought my private clients had been heavily regulated by the government for good reasons. But when I went to the NSA, I thought, wow, this is the most regulated agency on earth. And I don't mean that as a complaint at all. There are reasons for the redundant layers, for the layers of oversight. So within the NSA, I was very struck by the culture of adherence to the rule of law. People understood the significance of what they were doing. They understood the mission and the purpose to keep our country safe. And there was among other things, a culture of self-reporting errors or problems or things that went wrong, and inevitably something goes wrong in a large organization, but there was a culture of understanding that it was okay to speak up and say, I made a mistake, or someone else made a mistake, here's how we need to fix it, here's how we need to address it. And there wasn't anything that I feared, which was there would be sort of a chilling factor, you couldn't raise your hand, you couldn't admit a mistake, et cetera. No, exactly the reverse, which was incredibly important. And that's because we had, not only in my office, the General Counsel's office, there was a separate Inspector General who oversaw independently any questions of misdeeds or in something inappropriate. Fortunately, almost none during the period I was there, but still very important to have that person. There was a sense that if you wanted to be a whistleblower because you thought in good faith that something was wrong, you had an avenue and an ability to do that. Again, very important to keep up public confidence, as well as internal workforce feeling comfortable about it. And then, of course, outside, we can talk more about this, layers of oversight from the Pentagon, from the intelligence community, from other inspector generals, to congressional committees. So a lot of eyes, appropriately so, on this area, all for one purpose, which is designed to make sure we were complying with the relevant laws and the Constitution, and to provide a structure, including from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, that would give the public the confidence that these rules are being applied.
Yeah, and I want to we'll come back in a little bit to the times in recent history when the public's trust that the NSA and those, directing the NSA were in fact acting compliant with the law and the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. And the impact of that has, a lack of trust in that commitment to the rule of law on the ability of of our intelligence community to do what we ask them to do. So more on that to follow, but that's, very helpful. So Jeff, we're going to try this again. Hopefully this time we'll hear you. So pleased to have you here. And, it's interesting because we're talking about the value of the rule of law, and I will say over the years, any number of times I have sensed in the public discussion that there are those who have autocracy envy, right? That our adversaries don't have all these laws and this phalanx of lawyers that bog them down, and they can just move so much more decisively, et cetera. I know that you are a very strong believer that the rule of law makes us a stronger nation, enhances our national security, not just that it is, consistent with our Constitution and our values, but that it actually makes us stronger. And so I wonder if you could give us some specific examples of that.
Well, again, and I apologize, I'm late. As I said a moment ago, it proves the rule of law is alive and well in Washington because Connecticut Avenue and 17th Street were just completely shut by the police. So, but I'm here and in looking forward to this. I've been at this for about 50 some years now and have watched the evolution of national security law from almost nothing when in 1975, when I got into this business, there were 14 lawyers in the General Counsel's office at CIA. Only 2 people in the Justice Department worried about these issues. Nobody at the White House worried about them. Until now, it's a full-blown body of law, largely because of a reaction of the American people to what happened in Watergate, to some extent in Vietnam, and then in subsequent activities. There was no oversight of CIA to speak of. There were no congressional committees. Those are now in place. And Suzanne, you and I have seen these work. We've had to work through a lot of problems. Some of our allies were worried that they couldn't trust us to keep things secret anymore. We've worked through all of that, and I do think that the nation is better off. I think the intelligence agencies are better off with this oversight by Congress and within the executive branch. But it's always a battle. Keep in mind that the Iran-Contra crisis was set about by the Reagan administration deliberately choosing to ignore the Boland Amendment, which was law that forbade supporting the Contras. So they got around it by selling arms to Iran, which was illegal, and then jacking up the prices and using the proceeds to support the Contras. It nearly brought Reagan down, but when Poindexter said, well, Reagan didn't know anything about it, it all went away. But nevertheless, those kinds of things can always pop up. And I must say that one has to worry about what President Trump may be doing here that we don't know about, precisely because there is this impulse on the part of a substantial body of people in this country who think these laws are silly. They get in the way of protecting our national security, and that the president has supreme powers, the so-called unitary theory of the presidency. So I think we're in for some very difficult water here. The courts have thus far been standing strong, and we hope that holds, although we're so early in the process we don't know. But I do think that there is a general view among the American people that following the rule of law is important. There's a recent New York Times survey that says even 61% of Republicans believe that the president has to follow the Supreme Court if they order him to do something. So I have confidence that the American people have come to understand why following the rule of law is important. And, you know, it's not just following the law because it's the law. It's because, in my judgment and in my experience over the years, when we follow the rule of law in the formation and execution of our foreign policy, we get a better outcome than when we don't. And there are plenty of examples of where not following the rule of law has led to a bad outcome. So there are more reasons, thank heavens, why following the rule of law has led to a better outcome. But I think we're at a period where we have to start understanding why following the rule of law is important.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jeff. I think one of the things I always thought was interesting over the years, having been a lawyer for CIA, was people were surprised that CIA would have lawyers, because their assumption is the intelligence community, CIA, they violate the law all the time. They don't abide by the laws. And I had to sort of explain that, you know, they do have a legal framework and they do abide by U.S. laws. And that espionage, of course, is illegal in every country. So their operations overseas are almost always violating some domestic law of a country overseas. But in terms of U.S. law and the Constitution, that's why they have lawyers like us. And it was certainly my sense when I was there that as you say, and all of you have pointed out, those processes that are put in place as part of our commitment to the rule of law lead to more careful decision making, right? And it can be done very quickly. And I think FISA, Glenn, is a really good example of that, of a legal framework that was put in place to make sure that we were making wise decisions, that were compliant with the Fourth Amendment, and that there was a process that could be done very quickly in ways that don't hamper national security.
Absolutely, and we're about to sort of test that hypothesis again within the next year, because FISA, the most important section of FISA as relevant to national security, was extended about roughly a year and a half ago by Congress, and the extension expires in about a year from today. So Congress is going to have to start paying attention later this year to that particular section once again, of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. But to go back for a second, because you mentioned the history of it, without going into great detail, as a result of the abuses, mostly during the Nixon year, by the CIA and to some extent the National Security Agency and other agencies in terms of doing surveillance, including improper domestic surveillance as well as other other improper activities. Congress, after a series of hearings, was very energized and on a bipartisan basis, overwhelmingly crafted an entirely new statute, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was then amended significantly years later after 9/11, to give the intelligence community a set of tools completely consistent with the Constitution in a way that, again, bipartisan majorities of Congress recognize that was consistent with the Fourth Amendment, and yet gave our intelligence community and Defense Department, and also law enforcement for that matter, adequate tools to help keep our nation safe. And I think, although you could push the hypothesis a little bit, I think there's a darn good reason our nation, after the failures of 9/11, has been fundamentally safe. And one of those reasons has been the ability of our intelligence community to collect intelligence under something called Section 702 of FISA, which basically allows the United States government to do surveillance on foreign terrorists and other foreign targets of interest in a way, again, consistent with the Constitution, because inevitably some of them will talk to Americans, and that's where we want to make sure we're complying with the Fourth Amendment. So Congress is going to have an opportunity coming up soon, and sort of your question of why is this relevant, why do we worry about the rule of law, that's the exact answer, which is we want to make sure that the American public feels comfortable and confident that the people, the human beings and the institutions effectuating this law, carrying this law out, are doing so in a way compliant with the rules, compliant with the statutes, admitting where there are inevitably mistakes, and doing the right thing to help protect the country. And if we don't have that level of public confidence because of the rule of law being followed, that's going to make its way to members of Congress who will see that this doesn't enjoy public support, and we're going to wind up with a bad outcome here. And the bad outcome would be one that hurts our ability to keep our nation safe. So at the end of the day, public confidence and public trust is what is engendered by the rule of law, and that's why it's important.
And it's one of the reasons that congressional oversight is so critically
Absolutely.
important. FISA is an area where technology, the changes in technology, the dynamic nature of technology is such that we do now. I mean, it's sat unamended for a long time.
Yes.
But we now have to constantly be looking at it again to make sure that the way we wrote it and the safeguards we put in place and the authorities that we gave still make sense and are still protecting Americans,
Exactly.
both their civil liberties and their national security. And if congressional oversight is not functioning the way it is supposed to, intelligence cannot long sustain public support in a democracy. Democracy demands transparency.
Which is one reason, just to interrupt for a second.
Intelligence requires secrecy.
Right, just to interrupt for a second, one reason that I think it's been so important that some of the opinions of a secret court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the only secret court in America, are made public. They're declassified to a great extent. Sure, some details are still kept redacted to make sure we're not exposing the names of secret agents and things like that. But the fact that that is made public and that the public and members of Congress can see exactly how the court is making its decisions in this area is of critical importance.
It is, and it wasn't always that way.
Right.
And I don't think Americans necessarily fully appreciate that one of the ways we are committed to the rule of law is that we don't have secret laws in this country. Laws have to be out there, they have to be transparent, people have to be accountable, and Americans need to know what that law is, and Congress is part of that. Jeff, I don't know if you were also part of congressional oversight for a number of years, if you want to say a couple things about the importance of congressional oversight and the public trust and in making sure that we are making wise decisions, right? There are times when Congress has helped in that decision-making process.
Congress is critical, and I think you're absolutely right. There were two covert actions in my life that were proposed that were wacky. And when we went up to brief the Senate Intelligence Committee, they asked questions that, frankly, the administration should have thought about. And so we went back to our desks and we said, we're not going to do that. And that's an easy example of the advantages of thoughtful oversight, namely asking questions that those of us in government don't necessarily think of or don't put much weight to. So it really is critical. And I'm pleased to say that I think it has worked very well, but it only works if people are diligent about it, if they understand why it's important. And, I will as fond of the CIA as I am, they do have cowboys out there that go too far too fast. And one of the things that has always intrigued me is the point you made, I think, Suzanne, which is that the government has entrusted the intelligence community, CIA and NSA in particular, to a lesser extent DOD, but to do things that nobody else can do. And inherent in that is a responsibility to do them in a way that the senior leadership knows what's going on out there in the field and that they approve of it. And that, in my experience, the good CIA officers truly understand that. And they don't try to go out there and do dumb things. When I was there, and I'm sure when you were there were occasionally people that would get out of line and they were fired. But firing people is tricky because they know secrets and they can be troublesome. So it's a delicate balance, but the idea that we absolutely have to have the CIA and the NSA and the other intelligence and law enforcement agencies, but they have to follow the law. And I know that Bruce thinks the same way about the law enforcement agencies. It's a similar dynamic. You give them a badge and a gun, but they've got to follow the rules.
Yeah.
Was bringing it back to my days supervising the counterespionage section. I feel like it's not just, as you say, the intelligence community, it's law enforcement as well. But I think that the point you've all been making about public trust, I mean, the intelligence community, if you will, is a special case, but I think it's an important one. But I think we have a more fundamental issue really with public trust and rule of law. I always like to think I'm the most cynical person in the room, but I do think that rule of law has been a critical value in this country, and I'm afraid that because of the way it's been betrayed, people are too quick to assume that everything's corrupt anyway. What does it mean to have rule of law? And I think it's important for people to understand what this structure has meant in the past, why it's critical that it be preserved. In the Department of Justice, it goes to really the most fundamental aspects of the department in terms of prosecutorial discretion, in terms of how we think about bringing cases. We don't build cases to go after particular people. That's always been the rule. We build cases based on where the facts and the law go, no matter how inconvenient that may be. That's why it's been traditions over the years I was at the department that oftentimes the party in power found that leaders of their party, senior officials, were being prosecuted by our public integrity section because that was the way it was handled. And in the Attorney General's office, there's one of the rotunda, there's carved something that essentially says the United States wins its point when justice is done its citizens in the courts. And that's really the way it's been inculcated. Prosecutors make independent decisions working with agents, and courts are there to adjudicate, and you're there really to see that the right thing is done. But that's a hard message to get across to people because they're constantly being told, well, it's all a rigged system. And I think that one of the things that's important is that we preserve the structures that actually allow us to say, well, it's not rigged, and here's why. Here are the safeguards. Here's how rule of law is to make sure that it's not secret, that it's not ex post facto, that it's not a bill of attainder, which the Constitution forbids, where it's somebody reaching out from an executive position or a legislature and punishing a particular individual. Those are exactly what the framers of the Constitution wanted to prevent. And as you've all said, they've also separated powers for precisely that reason, to ensure that there's legislative oversight, to ensure the executive is not too powerful, to ensure that courts can adjudicate.
Yeah, I mean, I think a key element, as you noted early on in the rule of law, is to prevent arbitrary exercise of executive authority. That's right. A key element. I always think of Camelot, and might makes right, no right makes right. And one of the things I think is really important in that is this relationship between the White House and the Department of Justice, and even more so with regard to the FBI. Talk a little bit about that.
So in my experience, again, across Republican and Democratic administrations, and I think I served 9 attorney generals. The attorneys general, excuse me. The rule was that there was a very strict contacts policy with the White House. Only a few people were designated to be contacts, and those contacts ran through the general counsel's office at the White House, the White House counsel's office. The idea being that there should not be a politicalization of any kind of prosecutorial decision. To be sure, on policy matters, if the discussion was on FISA renewals, there would be a much more general discussion because then you are formulating policy. But when it came to particular cases, the idea was this should be done independently. And that's also true with regard to our international counterparts. I spent a great part of my career trying to explain to unhappy National Security Council and State Department colleagues, as I know you did at DHS, why we happen to be prosecuting somebody that they thought would interfere with our foreign relations. And they, in turn, I kept telling them they could say to their foreign counterparts, that's the Department of Justice, you just can't control them.
So foreign relations doesn't trump the rule of law?
Surprisingly, it did not repeatedly, as you know. I mean, you and I work together on these things. Time and again, we would bring cases that might be seen to be inconvenient. But I do think it goes back to the point everyone has made. Our national security is actually advanced by that, even by foreign prosecutions that might seem problematic at the time for foreign relations, because it established that we really did have an independent prosecutorial service, something that we actually had to go to some lengths to prove up, if you will, and we're part of the United States is part of the Council of Europe's more general international group of countries against corruption, and we do self-assessments of each other's joint assessments. And because of our mixed system, where the Attorney General is also a member of the cabinet, many countries argued we did not have an independent prosecutorial service, and our answer was we had an independent career prosecutorial service, and there were layers, including the White House context policy, to prevent that from becoming a politicized group of prosecutors.
Yeah. My sense is, and you saw it every day, that our commitment to the rule of law was really a critical aspect of our ability to get international support for the things we needed to do in our national security interest. I remember looking at the aftermath of the Libyan bombing of the Pan Am flight over Lockerbie back in, I think that was 1988, maybe, and trying to get an international coalition to impose sanctions on Libya. And we couldn't really get much traction until we decided to bring a case against the intelligence officials in the Libyan intelligence services against whom we had some actual evidence.
Right.
And taking that rule of law approach allowed us to build a coalition. There was frustration that it wasn't getting at Gaddafi, but in fact, that strong coalition around sanctions had the impact we were looking for, right? We see that in Ukraine when Putin first marched in. The reaction of the American public to that, they may not have ever attached the words rules-based order.
Right.
But what they were reacting to is, this isn't right. And it was that innate sense of that there are rules.
And I think you're right. When we've deviated, as Jeff said, it's actually hurt our national security. Post 9/11, the continuing allegations of torture and abuse, as recently as today, as you saw in the decisions yesterday in one of the Guantanamo cases, but it made building the coalition in terms of sharing evidence much more difficult in terms of the assurances we had to give. But I think it's also important that by recognizing that we had strayed from really where we are as a country normally, that it also helped build back up those relationships thereafter.
Yeah. Jeff, I think I certainly remember this and saw this. It became very clear to me post 9/11 in our counterterrorism efforts that, again, maintaining our commitment, trying to hew to that commitment to the rule of law was really important for our counterterrorism efforts. And that was when I first started getting uncomfortable with this way we always talk about balancing national security and civil liberties, as if they were mutually objective values on either side of a scale, and if you took away from one, if you just took away some civil liberties, you'd be more secure, and if you added to civil liberties, you'd be less secure. Instead of seeing the ways in which they are mutually reinforcing, the ways in which remembering what it is we are fighting for, and maintaining those relationships between the government and the governed, that relationship of trust, the strength that gives us. Talk a little bit about that.
Let me follow up on that for a moment, and also on points made earlier. Going back to 1945, we created an international order basically on the rule of law. The United Nations, NATO is an obligated treaty where it's a legally binding agreement on us and others. We built the global order based very much on the idea that rule of law was really important to maintain world order, and in particular, our view of it. And that is now being challenged very much by the Russians and the Chinese in this outfit, the BRIC. They are trying to create an alternative global order, not based on the rule of law, but based on their own view of how they ought to govern themselves, and we ought to stay out of their way with these Western ideas of the rule of law. I can't emphasize how important the points this group has been making about the importance of the rule of law here, but it also strengthens our role in the global world to say that it's important to follow the rule of law. And we haven't had a war in Europe since the end of the Second World War, but we do now. Because of the actions of Putin, which has clearly violated international law. And so I can't say how important it is that we follow the rule of law here, that we encourage it in other nations, and that it's got to be the formulation that makes us strong internationally, because we're now facing governments that are hostile to us who want to create an alternative basis for a world order that is not in our interest.
Yeah, and it does strike me that our adversaries see the kind of disarray and chaos that can arise when you sort of put aside the processes of the rule of law, for example, and the divisiveness, and see this as a real opportunity to take advantage of our weakness. Glenn?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And when there's some erosion of, or at least a perception even, let alone the actual erosion of rule of law domestically. So it has a domestic feature and consequence as well as international. International, we've just talked about, Jeff and others have just mentioned that point. But the U.S. succeeds in projecting its national power, its strategic power around the world, in part because we hold ourselves out as a model of the rule of law. We say we're following the rules. We're not perfect, we admit it, but we're trying to do our best, act in good faith in the rule of law. And that gives us a tremendous moral power around the country. When we don't do that internally, our example corrodes. There's nothing to follow. It doesn't look like a good model to follow. So we have to be very careful of that. And then domestically, the fact that if there is an erosion of the rule of law, or even an attempt to do so, or even the perception of it, it corrodes public trust, not only in the ways we talked about before, such as failing to build a national consensus around, say, a foreign policy statute or the renewal of the FISA statute. But you can imagine a situation in which, as Bruce said, due to the cynicism, the American public just simply doesn't believe anymore in its institutions, in the way Congress is handling something, in judgments by the intelligence community. And if we get to a point where, take something, I hope it never happens, but 3, 4, 5 years from now, China wants to invade Taiwan, and due to a combination of foreign disinformation, which is amplified already, an erosion of public trust in the United States and belief that our institutions are doing the right thing, maybe some part of the American public will say, well, we don't really trust the military, we don't really trust Congress to do the right thing, they're all making corrupt decisions, who knows whether the intelligence community is saying the right thing, so maybe we really will just let China take Taiwan. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but not that much of an exaggeration, and that's the kind of thing we need to worry about to make sure that at every step we can have the public confidence in institutions where we need it.
Yeah, I think credibility is such a critical, positive outcome of a clear commitment to the rule of law. And that is essential for being able to mobilize support behind the things we want to do. And the cynicism is a death knell for that. Bruce, one of the areas that I really worry about cynicism taking hold is the area of corruption.
Yes.
Is a sense, as you said, that there is a sense that the last administration is corrupt, this administration is corrupt. What's the difference? Why does it matter? Talk to us about specifically what's happening with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, why we should be concerned about that, and sort of generally why should individual Americans, what impact does corruption have on them? Why should they care?
Well, I think it is one of the central concerns that people should have, because corruption really does erode pretty much everything that this country has been built upon. If you can't ensure that people will have fair government decisions that are made by the executive, if they're concerned that the judiciary is not being independent, if their legislature, or at the state level or at the federal level, is considered not to be looking after interests, that is corrosive, because this country, our entire democracy, depends on the belief that, as we said at the outset, that individuals do have the ability to have their cases heard in both the specific and more general sense, to have their ideas taken. So I do think that it's critical, as you say, that we are not dismantling the protections that are there, because it's one thing to be cynical, but it's another thing to be able to say, okay, well, here are the facts. Because as I mentioned, across administrations, Republican and Democrat, we really do have a remarkable record, recognized by other countries, of going after public corruption and private corruption as well. And while I fully understand, having worked on this issue for so many years, the focus on cartels and transnational criminal organizations, because they can be a source of corruption, is the current administration's decision essentially to freeze Foreign Corrupt Practices Act investigations, which are a key post-Watergate reform, to dismantle the Kleptocracy Initiative, which is the group of investigators and prosecutors that were ensuring that money stolen by corrupt foreign officials did not end up in the United States or elsewhere, but that money was returned to the people of other countries, something that returned well over $1 billion to foreign victims during this time period. Or just generally the money laundering section, which is so critical, because if you do not have the people in place to ensure that ordinary citizens are not being victimized, that too is a form of corruption. So it's essential that we have those programs in place, and it's equally essential that we continue, I would submit, our overseas work. So at any given time, I had at least 50 or so federal prosecutors embedded in other countries working on these issues, in the same number of law enforcement agents or retired law enforcement agencies, and DHS had many of the same programs. Again, it's not just because we are noble people, although we do believe in the rule of law, but as a pragmatic matter, it advances our national security when we're able to deal with countries on a basis of trust, knowing that corruption is not the coin of the realm.
Yeah. So, and I think for individuals, government corruption means that decisions aren't being made on the basis of what's in the best interest of the country or its people. Right. Decisions are being made based on who's going to pay me the most. Right. So what you see in countries that are where their governments are corrupt is the people suffer. Right. They are
Absolutely.
Suffering. They are not being well governed.
I mean, look at buildings collapsing in countries where you have a system where the building inspector gets paid off, and it has real world consequences, which is a building collapses.
That's exactly
which is terrible.
Right. That's exactly right. And for businesses, now there may well be businesses who have chafed under not being able to bribe officials when companies from other countries have maybe less legal strictures. I think there are also companies who are relieved not to have to get into a bribery bidding war. Who's going to bribe the most to have that decision made, and who really want to compete on a fair playing field in which they are competing based on what they are offering in terms of their product or their services, rather than how much money they're offering.
I mean,
So I do
yeah.
think people think about this corruption perhaps as being some law enforcement matter. It matters to Americans.
And ironically, we've been remarkably successful over the past 25 years in having other countries come around to our point of view. So after Watergate with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, we were alone. But now under the UN Convention Against Corruption and the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, everyone has this obligation. And indeed, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act group spent an enormous amount of time prosecuting foreign companies that happened to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange or had some other jurisdictional connection. So the playing field was being greatly leveled to the advantage of US companies as well. So again, looking at just at the sheer monetary, pragmatic aspect of this, it is good for the United States.
Yeah. So we've gotten a few questions that have come in, and I want to tell folks if they want to ask questions, we've got a few more minutes. On the event page at CSIS, you can hit the question button and let us know your questions. But you know, there's a question about what can be done, right? What and both in sort of the general sense, what can people do who are concerned, maybe concerned about wanting to reinforce our commitment to the rule of law. And in very specific cases, we've got a question about Abrego Garcia, the Maryland man who was mistakenly deported down to El Salvador, and what's happening in the courts in terms of defiance, whether in fact the administration defied a court order. And the question is sort of, what can the court do? What are the avenues open? The judge is talking about perhaps bringing DOJ officials in to testify, et cetera. But, kind of how do we, can the system deal with, if there is a decision to openly defy, can the system deal with that?
Well, that comes to the question that, of course, everyone is asking, are we at the stage of a constitutional crisis yet? Because that really is a separation of powers issue. In many ways, the storyline so far is one that validates, again, the notion of due process. You've seen it up to the Supreme Court level. You saw it in the really quite remarkable opinion by a senior judge.
Harvey Wilkinson, yeah.
Exactly, and who's a Reagan appointee. Yes, I think that's right. And making the point that the question is not this individual. The question is, what does due process require? So I think that in terms of the Supreme Court decision, it was that the administration had to take steps to facilitate his return from El Salvador. So I think it's, of course, it will be up to the district court, but taking the direction of trying to see what steps have been taken, if any, to facilitate would seem to be the logical next step from a discovery point of view. If no steps were taken, or if the steps were not taken in good faith, then the question becomes whether there was contempt of the court's decision and what steps would be taken at that point. Whether the administration decides to take further steps, I think, will determine whether this is a matter that's simply resolved as a due process matter or does become a more serious crisis for our system.
I recently wrote a piece about the constitutional crisis and the independence of the courts, emphasizing that if the administration wants a confrontation, if in some sense they are seeking that, or are at least even just willing to go there, it's going to happen. And better that confrontation happen because the court is doing its job than that it come because it was sort of cowed into submission to avoid a constitutional crisis, right? That would be a crisis in and of itself of the independence of the court. And Jeff, we have over the years seen this issue of a potential clash, right, certainly between Congress and the executive branch. We saw it in the covert action discussions around notifying Congress about covert action before it is undertaken by the administration. And these concerns have come up time and again. And how have we resolved them in the past?
Well, we've resolved it by working it out. And one thing I would often tell my government clients, both at CIA and when I was at the State Department, is, gee, this is a great idea, but you're going to have to sit in front of a congressional, I don't think it's a good idea, but you do, and you're going to have to sit in front of a congressional committee and explain it. It won't be me, it'll be you. And that was a pretty sobering way to treat a lot of these because Congress does play this vital role. But there's also, I'm concerned about two issues here, and I'll do it quickly. One is the fact that the administration is relying very heavily on the deferences that the courts generally pay to the president and the executive branch in matters of national security. I think they're abusing that very dramatically now, and the courts are going to face an issue. Are they going to begin to say, we no longer respect that, and you're going to have to come up here and convince us why, not just tell us that we have to defer to you. So the administration may be causing long-term harm to the president's powers in ways they haven't thought about. And the second thing I'm worried about is the fact that the two oversight committees, particularly in the House, are becoming increasingly political. We saw that particularly in the last administration when Mr. Nunes was running the House committee. The allegation that we're weaponizing the law enforcement community and the intelligence community just makes me very angry because it risks all kinds of long-term harm. So somehow or another, first of all, let me be very frank, the president and his guys have got to stop this quickly and understand what they're doing. And secondly, the American people have to be willing to support those men and women who serve, and they don't do so to make a lot of money. They do it because they believe deeply in this country. They have a mission. That's why they go to work in the morning. And they have to be supported, and they have to know we support them.
Yeah, and supporting them includes, making sure that they are complying with the rule of law. Because I saw too often when intelligence community folks were told to go do something that that political environment seemed to justify, and then the political winds change and the sands shifted beneath their feet, and they were suddenly hung out to dry.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen, or is far less likely to happen if you are really committed to the rule of law and you are open to getting that kind of advice from your lawyers and the people around you. I think it's an important way of supporting them.
Excuse me, so it goes back to the point you made earlier, which is the importance of the process.
Yeah.
And following the process, which a lot of people get frustrated by, but it's critical.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it also goes to the point, as you say, that one of the key features of rule of law is that it has to be prospective, not retroactive, that you cannot and should not punish people for things that were not unlawful at the time.
Right. But you also should not be putting people out on a ledge.
No. To test what is the limits,
and then not
pushing
supporting
them,
them,
exactly,
and then
yes,
not supporting
right,
them when
yeah.
they get pushed off the edge.
Exactly.
So we're about out of time. It's been a sobering, very interesting, but sobering conversation, and I try to end on a somewhat hopeful note. And it's a challenge in this arena because I think there is much reason for concern today. But I want to give each of you an opportunity to share something that gives you some sense of hope. Or perhaps, just even the most important message you'd want to leave people with in this area of rule of law and national security. Glenn, I'm going to put you on the spot.
You're
first.
You're a hopeful type. Glenn.
I didn't give you a heads
Exactly,
up on this, so I
Okay,
apologize.
hopeful. All right, be
Yeah.
hopeful. Go back to Bruce's opening comment about how this nation was founded. If you go back and look at the reason we have the Declaration of Independence, it's because this country was protesting against the despotic efforts of the British king, and there was a very strong desire for decisions to be made based on the rule of law and not the decisions of this king that were completely non-legal in that regard. And so that's the basis of this country. That's been our heritage for well over 2 centuries, and I think that's such a deep, fundamental aspect of the American personality, the way our country grew and expanded from one coast to another, that it's so deep in the country that I think it's going to be extremely difficult, not impossible, to completely eradicate it. And so I do feel ultimately hopeful that our country is strong enough to weather the vicissitudes of very intense political days today, great polarization. I'm not minimizing it or condoning it and not saying there isn't a problem, but at the end of the day, I feel that the core principles are strong enough and resilient enough to do that. I hope I'm not proven wrong. I think I'm right, and we'll have to have this program again in a few years to make sure I'm right.
If it's allowed, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, right. Well, I think, let me build on Ben's point. I too think this is obviously a critical time for the future of rule of law in the United States. I think that we do have to be concerned about institutional erosion, attacks on the career people that Jeff has pointed out really have gone into this because of a sense of mission, not to go after people of other parties, but really to protect the American public. So I think that that's important. But in defense of Glenn's idea that maybe there is still a fundamental sense of what this rule of law, what due process requires, I think it is remarkable that polling suggests that even with all of the allegations that are being made against some of the people that have been deported, that still there seems to be support, general support for the idea that there has to be some kind of process in place. And that's such a core concept of rule of law. It does give me hope, even though the courts are an imperfect way of doing it because they can only act retrospectively. I think they have held up well, and I think the reaction of the American people, at least thus far, does provide some basis for thinking maybe, as Glenn says, we'll work this through.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were surprised that there was a 9-0
Right.
Opinion of the Supreme Court that these folks who are being deported must be given adequate notice and
Yeah.
due process,
Right.
opportunity to appear in front of an independent magistrate, I think, and make their case. So that is cause for hope. Jeff?
Well, I'm a Midwesterner, and by nature I'm optimistic, but I'm very pessimistic, principally because I do not think President Trump is listening. I don't think he appreciates the things we've been talking about here. I hope he comes to realize how important the rule of law is, but I've seen very little evidence of that. And until he begins to feel enormous political pressure from the various elements of American society, I think he's just going to keep pushing. He has people around him who have this wacky theory about a unitary president. He likes power. He's cozying up to adversaries across the world that do not have our interest in heart, but he likes them because they're strong people, strong leaders. I'm very worried, and we have a long time with this president yet. So we're going to have to keep hammering away. It may be like old-time, big-time Big Ten football, 3 or 4 yards at a shot here, but that's what we're going to have to do as a country. The courts are going to have to do it, and we're going to have to support them.
And I would say, adding to that, I think if people were asked, what can they do? I think reaching out to one's congressperson is key on all of this, because so much of this will depend, as everyone has said, on the separation of powers aspect of rule of law. So that's one practical thing that can be done on a daily basis.
Yes, exactly. No, I think that's right. And what I hear from all of you is, at the end of the day, it is up to the American public. Right? We often put everything on our institutions. The institutions have to rise to the occasion, and they do. But they will not do it unless we demand it of them. Mm-hmm. It really is we the people, and we have to hold our institutions accountable. And as you say, Congress is not going to rise up and exercise its appropriate constitutional authority as a separate but co-equal branch of government unless the constituents demand that they do so. And I've talked about this a lot. I'm a big baseball fan. And a number of years ago at a baseball game, I listened and sang along, because I think we should sing along to the national anthem. And the anthem that we sing, and realize it starts with this question, and it never answers the question, it ends with the same question. It ends with a question mark. Right. Oh, say, does that Star-Spangled Banner still wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? And it is up to each and every one of us to make sure that we're doing everything we can every day to make sure the answer to that question is yes. And at the end of the day, it's up to us. And that is what gives me hope, because at the end of the day, I do believe and so many Americans get this and will do what needs to be done. So I want to also thank you, the three of you. Thomas Jefferson said, that he knows of no safe repository of the government's power and national security power but the people. And if we think them not capable of exercising that discretion, then we need to inform it, not take it away from them. And you all have helped to inform all of us. I've learned a lot. And I thank you, all three of you, for your service. And I thank you for being here today. And thanks to all of you who tuned in to watch.